during the first Constituent Assembly, I was the member of the State Restructuring Committee. And in that committee, as a member, I had really tried my best to deliver the Constitution as per the demand of those groups who have not been well represented and whose issues and concerns has to be here in the new Constitution. So we were making new Constitution not to, just participate in the political power games, but to really identify those concerns and issues where we can sort out the issues that has been left by the conflict to be sought out and dealt very properly and in a sustainable way.
I've been working with the ethnic minority groups in Burma or Myanmar for over 15 years. And during the first part of that period, it was a situation of ongoing civil war. At this point, there is a ceasefire for half of the groups, but not the other half. And part of the peace process is discussion about changing the Constitution to address the underlying causes of the conflict. So we've been advising the ethnic minority groups in that process. I've also worked with the Law Reform Commission, the Gender Minister, and the President pro tempore of the Senate in Liberia on proposed constitutional amendments in that country. And I have advised reformers in a number of other countries about constitutional reform.
I tend to advise on making constitutions and revising them and making them better. In my country, in the latest round of constitution making in 2011, not a single woman was involved. Maybe this was an accident, although judging by the policy preferences of the government, it may have been on purpose. This is a very bitter experience for a female academic who has devoted her life to making constitutions better and making women part of politics, constitutional academia, and advocacy.
Well, as rule of law advisor at UN Women, I'm responsible for lawmaking, constitution building, as well as access to justice with reference to women and girls. I participated in this meeting because in March of next year, which is going to be the year 2020, the Beijing Declaration and Platform for Action is going to be 25 years old. And the Commission on the Status of Women will be reflecting on achievements, will be reviewing progress being made in the implementation of the 12 critical areas of action. And lawmaking and constitution building actually form a cross-cutting element of the Beijing Declaration and Platform for Action.
Before I was appointed to the consultative committee, I had already written the proposed charter for the Bicol autonomy. And that was when we were fighting for an autonomous region. However, when the president ran in 2016, before that, he met with us and he told us to shift from autonomy to a federal movement, because he felt that it is no longer viable to just ask for autonomy. We really have to veer away from a highly centralized form of government. And prior to all of these, I was working in the House of Representatives. Initially, I was working with the Office of the Speaker, and then I was a bill drafter, I was a senior constitutional consultant for another unit, and then eventually I became the director of the legal cluster of committees, under which was the Committee on Constitutional Amendments and Electoral Reforms.
Constitution making is not just writing a constitution, it's also making an existing constitution alive, making it real for the people so that it works for them. And I think my experience as chair of the government panel that negotiated the peace agreement with the more Islamic Liberation Front in our country is precisely that, to show that there are elements in our constitution that can give life to their demand for internal self-determination. Of course, they move from a demand of external self-determination to one that is within the framework of the country. And to that extent, there are many items in the 1987 Philippine Constitution, itself a product of the democratic struggle of the Filipino people,
coming from a dictatorship and putting all of these elements in place, trying to address the different conflicts that grew out of that dictatorship, precisely there are elements there. But of course, not everything can be accommodated within an existing constitutional framework. But we have to see these kinds of reforms that they do not necessarily happen all in one place, that they can be very evolutionary reforms.
I am one of the Tunisian women who were involved in the drafting of 2014 constitution. And I was the deputy speaker of the Constituent Assembly. Well, it was a very, let's say, exciting experience. Tunisia is a country where women have a very progressive status since 1956, that is to say, since independence. Yet, I think what we achieved as women being involved in drafting the Constitution is acquiring a real political competence and experience, and also contributing to draft a constitution that is really belonging to a new generation of constitutions, a constitutions that gave women their due place, a constitution that really confirms the importance of individual and public liberties, a constitution that set a balance between executive, legislative, and civil society.
I was a member of the Northern Ireland Human Rights Commission, which was an institution established by the peace agreement, the Belfast Agreement. And one of its roles was to draft and advise on a Bill of Rights for Northern Ireland. And so I spent really, 4 years of my life consulting with local groups in many, many meetings, and working with commissioners and other stakeholders to try to formulate what a Bill of Rights for Northern Ireland would contain. That Bill of Rights didn't come to fruition, it wasn't ever passed, but many of the issues that ultimately collapsed the political institutions a couple of years ago were issues that the Bill of Rights had in its draft did deal with, such as language rights. So I think had it been successful, it would have provided a kind of stabilising role to the institutions, and I would hope that passing the Bill of Rights still could. Now we do a lot of work supporting comparative constitution design options in other processes, trying to support women in other processes and indeed other constituencies that seek inclusion or are trying to make a positive contribution in their constitution making processes.
I've been working in providing support to constitution building processes over the last 10 years in different contexts. And while still the situation regarding women's participation varies, I would say, from context to context, I think there's good news and bad news. One is over the course of the last 10 years, I've certainly seen an increase in women's participation, an increase in the strengthening of the norm that is, I think it's more accepted, that it's very important for all sectors of the population, including women, to participate. But at the same time, as I said in the opening of the conference, I still feel that we're in a place where it's being seen as a concession rather than something entirely normal and right. And often it is that women's groups are often sort of begging for inclusion and as if they're asking for something rather than taking their rightful place at the table automatically. So still work to be done.
I mostly work with women in conflict-affected contexts in making sure that their voices are heard and also that they're seen as legitimate political actors. And that involves not only obviously participation in constitution drafting processes, but also going way before that to making sure that women are heard and participate in peace processes, because those peace processes set the stage for constitution drafting. In addition, I also work with a number of constitution drafting NGOs, mostly international NGOs. So those are the organizations that are often supporting either parties or conflict actors in setting constitutional processes and design. And interestingly, I think one of the challenges there is that within those organizations, they're often not thinking about gender and women. So not only I find it my job to convince parties and conflict actors that women's participation is important, but also mainstreaming kind of gender awareness and the importance of women's participation within the organizations that support them. So women's participation in constitution making is important for obviously a variety of reasons, but I think one of the most salient ones is that women often advocate for things like gender equality and the rights of marginalized groups. And this is particularly important in conflict-affected contexts because research has shown that gender equality and the status of women is directly correlated with peacefulness. So gender equality is actually a better indicator of a state's peacefulness, better than things like democracy or GDP. Also, in terms of women's representation, research has shown that the more women you have in the legislature, in parliament, the less likely a state is likely to use violence in times of crisis. So women's participation has a direct correlation with peace, long-term peace and stability.
Well, women are half or more than half of the population in pretty much every country in the world, and it can't be really called a democratic constitution if it wasn't produced by bodies that include substantial numbers of women. I think that it's sort of striking that in most countries where there is an ethnic or religious group that is even 30 or 40% of the population, people have no trouble understanding why, if they were excluded from the process, it would be an anti-democratic constitution. But when women are 50%, somehow still this is a mysterious argument.
I think that women, in contributing to this new generation of constitutions, they brought their own vision. They brought our sense of pragmatism and also their sensitivity to the issue of rights and liberties. Not only their rights and liberties, but the rights and liberties of minorities, of children, of disabled persons. And from my experience, the contribution of women in the Constitution was not limited to women issues, but it was indeed extended to all issues of rights, economic and social rights, to liberties, to future, how to secure a future for the coming generations, and also how to consolidate democracy. And I can say that wherever democracy progresses, women's rights progresses.
Because women's participation in politics and life is important, and without their participation in constitution making, somehow they will get excluded from politics and real life in the end.
Women's participation is important, I think, for a number of reasons. Firstly, the Constitution should be made in the name of we the people, and excluding 50% of the population never seems to be a good idea. Certainly all-inclusive constitution-making processes seem to lead to more democratic constitutions and more enduring constitutions. Secondly, as we've heard during many of the panel discussions, the voice of women have been critical often in reaching across divides, and constitution making often takes place in divided societies with entrenched political divisions, and we've heard a number of instances where women were able to bridge those divides, in particular in terms of peace processes.
Later on, after the negotiation in the peace process, from the both parties, from the government and from the state and from the other conflicting groups, it has been come to a conclusion that there should be a new constitution through which the unrepresented groups, especially women, disadvantaged sections, indigenous and marginalized communities, will be taken into account. Their participation will be one of the priority agenda in the new constitution. Therefore, to bring the peace process into the logical end, there is a need and there is an urgent, special demand for the representation of women in the new constitution as well.
Women make up the majority of the populations of the various countries that they come from in the main. But more importantly, the 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development insists that no group should be left behind in any development process of any kind. And we know that constitution making and constitution building are key elements of development. If anything at all, they constitute the cornerstone of development. So therefore, we cannot afford to leave even girls behind. So I would say both women and girls should never be left behind in constitution making, because the constitutions of different countries of the world reflect the priorities of government, they reflect the priorities of the state, and women and girls are sovereign in their own rights and should be given an opportunity to participate in a meaningful way.
Well, I think the most important reason for women to be included in the process is to ensure that there will be a recognition of their equal role in building a nation and in ensuring that the concerns of women are adequately responded to in the making of the Constitution.
You never ask why men's participation is important, and then why do we have to justify why women's participation is important? I mean, men and women's participation and all other genders' participation in decision-making is important precisely because this is what society is made of. And you need all kinds of perspectives, all kinds of experiences that will have to get into the picture when you craft the fundamental law of the land.
I think this has become one of the first dialogue of women who are the council makers in their own respective regions and who have really played a prominent role in making council making process. So I think this will definitely brings our common effort together globally.
First of all, is that it's not sufficient to have good constitutions and good legislative texts. The most important thing is how to implement them, how to transform them into a mentality, a culture, and a reality. Second is women shall not limit their concern and their attention to women's issue. Women are human beings. Women are full citizens. So they are concerned by all issues concerning their society. And this is why women shall also work on these issues to be transformed into a group that interests and draws the attention of politicians, not only because of women issues, but because they represent a political force.
I think what's been really striking in the conversation here is that despite the many differences between the countries and the challenges that they face and the particular constitutional issues they're struggling with, there is a huge amount that can be learned from one country and applied to another. Not simply borrowing a constitutional solution, but understanding the way in which certain constitutional structures or proposals relate to particular underlying problems. So I've just been very struck by how much we have to learn from each other.
Well, the women's issue, the gender issue are really embedded in all the elements of constitution making. So while it's very important to have very, very special provisions for women, to have experts on gender issues, it's also very important to have women who are experts in all the other components, whether it's about security, structures of government, fiscal matters, and all that. You need that kind of expertise across the ranks being mobilized. But the point is, the problem is, a lot of women have been ignored. A lot of very, very capable women have never been given the chance. And I think that's the real problem, to provide that kind of access, that kind of opportunity through certain affirmative measures to enable women to be able to show that they know, they can, and that you can actually do it without them.
we don't always have to be in the same disciplines to participate in constitution making. In fact, women are diverse. We have to celebrate and appreciate the diversity of skills and disciplines that different women bring. Some women are politicians, some are economists, some are lawyers, some have specialized in constitution making. Specifically, others have specialized in decentralization and federalism as a discipline. And I believe that bringing all these skills, disciplines, as well as priorities together is what would make a very strong constitution building process.
Given that we sort of came to discuss, gender implications of constitution making, it might sound strange, but I think what really came across for me was the extent to which issues of inclusion of women and issues of sort of good governance and good functional institutions are really bound up together. So many of the issues we dealt with around, federalization versus unity and how did those work, whether an Islamic concept of the state was in contradistinction to human rights. These are actually issues that are at the heart of some of the tensions that need to be worked out. But they're issues that both really implicate women's rights. So somehow when you talk about women's rights, you're talking really about how you resolve some of these deepest issues. So I think what really came out for me was the extent to which all constitutional experts need to be gender experts. And gender experts don't just speak to a gender piece, but really to the entirety of constitutional design.
As a peacebuilding practitioner, I mostly work on constitution process and design. And so this really focuses on how do we resolve things like root causes and conflict drivers through constitution processes. As a result, I feel like a lot of times we are kind of looking at the short term. And what this conference has really shown me is that it's not just about how do we solve the conflict, but looking more long term. And I think one thing that I've learned is that implementation is so important, obviously. But one thing we aren't thinking about is what implementation looks like in the medium term. So how will the provisions that we put into the Constitution come together in not just the immediate legislative process, but in subsequent 2 to 3 terms later? How will those constitution provisions evolve? And how will that support peace and stability is one thing I think that I haven't really thought about very much. And so it's great to be able to have that discussion here with so many experienced and women with such great expertise.
In many of these constitutions, women's issues are becoming a particularly serious concern. But I'm glad that in my country, we're not very particular about that anymore because the policies have been laid down prior to this, and legislation favoring or protecting the interests of women and children have already been enacted.
Most of the discussion has not really focused on electoral quotas and just representation, and I think that's very important. A lot of the literature and the work being done in women's involvement in constitution making and what constitutions can do for women, I think has been overly focused on just getting women into the legislature. But here we heard a lot of discussion about federalism, systems of government, and how that can also help women going forward. And secondly, I just think a validation that a network like this is something that could be really important and useful for women constitution makers to talk to their peers who are undergoing constitution making processes, to talk to other women that have been through these processes before, and could be a really useful resource for the future.
That women are invincible, they are extremely creative, they are bridge builders, and I had encountered more creativity about constitutional solutions as well as about how to get to these solutions at this meeting than for many, many years in previous work.